Hey Beacon, welcome home to your Bounce Back Blueprint Community Podcast, where you are challenged to be, do, and have God's best as you thrive on your journey from setback to success. I'm your Bounce Back guide, Tiffany Huff-Strothers, and I'll be guiding you on the journey by sharing tips, tools, and the tea on how I was able to bounce back from escaping death, healing from heartbreak, and finding hope in homelessness. And then I wrote an award-winning book all about it. And shout out to God, ever since I was courageous enough to share my story, my life and the lives of women around the world have been forever changed. And as a member of the Bounce Back Blueprint community, I'm called to teach you to do the same. So grab your journal and let's build this blueprint. Hey Beacon, hey. Welcome back to your Bounce Back Blueprint Community Podcast. How you doing? What's new? I feel like I haven't spoken to you guys in forever, and I would love to catch up with you. This week, you are really in for a great treat. I had the pleasure in June to be a guest on the Pain to Purpose podcast, sharing my journey from setback to impact. And I know in previous episodes, like the one about how my morning ritual changed my life, and also in the Cornerstone episodes, I've given you bits and pieces of my journey. But this week, you are going to get an even more in-depth look at the journey of your bounce back guide. And over the next few episodes, I'm going to unpack it for you a little bit more. But this is the overview. This is like all of the tea. And if you want the extended version, of course, you can grab your copy of 30 Days Stay for more detailed insight. But without further ado, I am going to give you my episode from the Pain and Purpose podcast, moving from setback to impact. Enjoy.
Tiffany Huff-Strothers is a wife, mother, and a woman of faith. She's been called to minister and mentor women and is passionate about helping women reinvent themselves following their worst setbacks to make major impact. She lives out her calling as an evangelist, award-winning author, sought-after speaker, coach, and domestic violence survivor and advocate. Tiffany recognized her gift to uplift at a very early age, as her family became the billboard example for the epidemics plaguing the Black community. From drug abuse and single parenthood to gangs, poverty, and divorce. Nonetheless, Tiffany became the first in her family to graduate college and receive numerous scholarships, including one from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to attend graduate school. In the midst of her graduate study, she found herself in a relationship she had no idea how to end. And seemingly, she went from working hard and being a mother and student to being heartbroken and homeless after being shot by her first love. Refusing to accept her worst setback as defeat, she began a journey of reinvention and has become the go-to for other women on the journey to becoming the same. Tiffany's resilience and resourcefulness is known to be a catalyst for changing lives after every single encounter. She is the founder and director of When She Thrives, a nonprofit with the mission to break generational cycles of single motherhood. And she has such a powerful testimony. We touched on it just briefly right now, but I can't wait for you to hear directly from her story.
Hello, I'm Tiffany Huff-Strothers, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to share with you today. And so I'd like to say, I have this story, right? And it is the pain that led to my purpose, but I kind of want to give you the background of how I even got into the pain, if that makes sense. So from the time that I was a little girl, I was very smart, I was in scholars classes, gifted classes. They wanted me to skip grades, but my dad was not having that. But I was very smart. And so I was the one in my family who was the one. My sister had been very similar to me, my older sister, but she got pregnant as a teenager. And then my brother, also very smart, but ended up into the gangs with the 90s and going in and out of jail. So our family was really like the billboard for epidemics in the Black community. My dad ended up on drugs. My parents got divorced. My mom had mental health issues. And then there was me. All I wanted to do was read books and get good grades in school. And so my parents, whether they were together or apart, always told me that I could do and be anything that I wanted to, right? And I know that um, we still want to encourage our children and each other in that way, but I want you to hear my heart when I say that can be detrimental. So that rang true in my life. You know, my mom would say, if you get good grades, you'll get a scholarship. That happened. I got scholarships. And then, you know, if you work hard in college, you'll get good jobs. And that happened. And I got what other people would have believed were good jobs, right? Um, but for all of that time, I was dealing with this unspoken burden of carrying the weight of my family on my shoulders because I was the one. I was the one who was supposed to make it, and I was supposed to do it the way that they, fill in the blank with whomever they is, the way that they expected it to be, the way they expected success to look. And that was even at the expense of my truest self. So, in the midst of all of this, I got into a relationship towards the end of high school and was in this relationship ultimately for about a decade. I grew up in this relationship, and this relationship is where the pain actually started. Um, you know, we were in high school. We didn't go to the same high school, but we were in high school together. So we were, you know, that high school sweetheart thing, and we were in love. We were definitely in love, but um, we had challenges. And a lot of our challenges came from his insecurity because of how I was flourishing, because of how I was growing, because of how quote unquote successful I was being. It made him insecure about whether or not we would stay together because we were not on the same paths. He was like the bad boy and I was the good girl, right? And the challenge though was that even though there were there were signs very early on that this was not going to be the relationship for me, I still was holding on to that seed that was planted so long ago in my youth that I could be successful at anything. And if I worked hard enough, I can make anything work, you know, and I didn't realize until many years later, after everything I'd gone through in this relationship, that that is what kept me longer than anything. There was nothing I had set out to do that I was not successful at. I mean, I get chills just thinking about it now. And so, like I said, we started dating probably the summer before senior year. Yes, the summer before senior year, and it was great. We didn't go to the prom together. I went to the prom with one of my best friends. But you know, that summer we were like white on rice. And everything was everything was fine up until the point where it was time for me to leave to go away to school. And once I left, things got kind of rocky. And then while I was at school, things were rocky at the university I was at. So I went to Lincoln University for a semester. And during my first semester, and I don't know if you know anything about HBCUs or Lincoln, but when I went to Lincoln, they were in the midst of like a financial crisis because there was some issues with the administration, there was some embezzlement. And so it was just a hot mess. Like people couldn't get books, there was no toilet paper in the dorms. It was rough. So I decided after the first semester that I was going to transfer out. And one of the scholarships that I had received, because I had so many scholarships, one of the scholarships that I had received, the director of the program became a mentor for me. And he talked me into coming back home to Pittsburgh because I was like, well, I'll just pick another HBCU and go there. He encouraged me to come back home to Pittsburgh. And because of all of the scholarship money I had, he told me that if I needed to get an apartment, I could use my scholarship funding for that because my home life wasn't very stable at that time either. So I came home, and we were able to, quote unquote, get the relationship back on track. And that semester, I was able to get my own apartment, which he moved into with me. And very shortly thereafter, things progressively got out of hand. And, it's just talking through this out loud is very interesting, because for as smart as I was and as successful as I was, and as long as I spent watching Lifetime movies, I just, I could not, or I was not willing to accept that I could not make this thing work. I was willing to give everything. And in fact, I almost did give everything. So, um, by the time we had about 6 or 7 years in, I'm done with college. I'm into graduate school. I got pregnant. And then about a year and a half later, well, about a year and a half later almost, we had another baby. So we're 2 kids in at this point, and the relationship is very tumultuous. Abuse in all forms, physical, mental, emotional, you name it. I had become very isolated because I was ashamed, like I said, I was successful in everything else, and this was like the black spot on the resume of my life. And so I didn't want people to see it. I didn't want people to know it. I wanted to fix it, and I wanted to be successful because we had 2 beautiful kids and we looked so great in our family portraits, but everything was a mess. And finally, um, one Christmas, in fact, my older son's first Christmas, things got really bad. And one day he left, and I literally moved the house while he was gone. Like, I'm talking about, the Christmas tree still had bulbs on it. I did not take any decorations off the tree or anything. I literally moved while he was out. And I was able to stay secluded for quite some time. It was obviously a very challenging thing because it was, like I said, our son's first Christmas. So I did still take my son to see, his grandparents and the family. So we did have some interaction. But he didn't end up seeing his dad for Christmas, which was hard. And so way after the fact, well, not way after the fact, just before New Year's, he called me and he really wanted to see the baby. And I'm like, okay, but I didn't want him to know where I moved to. So we went to a hotel so he could see the baby. One thing led to another. That's when I got pregnant with my second son. And so hopefully this is a judgment-free zone. And so again, we end up back together, trying to make it work, trying to do what's right for the kids. And of course, the same things started to arise again, and the cycles of abuse came back. And so finally, we split once and for all. I moved again, probably a year or so later. And at this point, well, let me back up. By the time I'd had my second son, things were completely out of hand. Um, and so by the time I moved, it was very tumultuous. I had to go and get a PFA paper on him because he was like showing up at my house. He was stalking me. He was calling me all times of the night, like to the extent that I had to like turn all ringers off. And it was just crazy. It was just a lifetime movie turned real. Like several times this summer before everything ended with a bang, like I literally would have to be escorted by the police out of my neighborhood towards the direction of my sister's house, because he would be at my house, he would be harassing me and threatening me, and I just didn't feel safe at home. And finally, in July of that year, I stayed with a friend for the whole month of July. That's how afraid I was to be at home alone. And then after he realized that I wasn't home, even though he didn't know where I was, he kind of lightened up for a little bit. And I had been there for a month, and I'm just like, I want to go home, like I want to be in my own space. So I went home at the very end of July, and the first weekend in August, He broke into my home. So I should back up a little bit. Couple weeks before he broke into my home, he climbed through the window at my house. And let me tell you, he was a big guy. Like, I'm talking 6'4", over 300 pounds. Like, he was a big guy. To this day, I do not know how he made it through that window, but you know what? Determination. When you have determination, you can do anything. So he climbed through the window. And in fact, he really just wanted to talk to me. Um, so we did talk, and he ended up leaving without incident. But I had a slum landlord, and he didn't come fix my window. It wouldn't lock. So I jimmied it with a board so that he couldn't lift it. So this next time when he came, he, I think, again, attempted to climb in the window. And when he realized it was jimmied shut, he was still determined to get in. So he literally shot through a window, put his hand through the glass to unlock the door, and came into my home. Now, on this particular night, I had my two children. So my oldest son was about a little more than 2. My younger son was just shy of his first birthday. And I had my niece, who was 5, and my nephew, who was also about 2. He and my son are the same age. And so I heard a noise, but I had a window unit air conditioner. And so I thought that one of the kids fell out of the bed. So I opened my bedroom door, and I could hear him walking on the glass that he shattered. And I didn't even consider that someone had like broken into my house, like it was a robbery or anything. I knew immediately it was him. And so I called out his name, and probably before I could get his name all the way out of my mouth, I saw him coming up the steps with a gun. And my bedroom was like right at the top of the steps. So he got to the top of the steps. Again, this is a big guy. Like, he flew up those steps. Like, I'm telling you, this day, this night, in this season, he had superhuman strength, because he was not athletic by any means. He was a big guy, but he ran up those steps so quickly. Like, I had no time to react. And he just kind of like shoved me into my bedroom, and this gun is like right at the ridge of my nose, and I'm just like in shock, probably for at least 2 or 3 minutes, which is a long time when you're in a situation like that. I don't have any clothes on because I'm, in my home sleep. It's August, and he backs me into the room. He's screaming, he's yelling, he's smacking me, and I don't even know how long this went on, but he had like backed me onto the edge of my bed, and I was sitting there. And when someone tells you that their life flashed before their eyes, it's not a lie. Like, I literally sat on the edge of that bed, and my life was flashing before my eyes. I could see like myself in the hospital breastfeeding my son. I could see like my children taking a picture at daycare. I could see like my high school graduation. I could see very clearly this picture of my father and I on my grandmother's porch, and me like kissing his cheek. Like, these things were so vivid in my mind, and I was so afraid, and I got very, very nervous, and I felt like I was going to go to the bathroom on myself. This in the midst of, like I said, him smacking me and screaming and hollering, and me thinking about these 4 babies that are in the room next to us, and me trying to say, like, our kids are here. There are kids here. Like, you don't have to do this. And so I got nervous, and I said, I'm going to have an accident. Like, I really need to go to the bathroom. So he let me get up, and he was like walking me. He was like following me to the bathroom. Mind you, this gun has not moved from the ridge of my nose. So we're walking towards the bathroom, and he like got upset all over again, and he like pushed me against the wall, at which point he and I are now eye to eye, because when we were on the bed, I was basically just eye to eye with the barrel of that gun. I wasn't necessarily looking at him. But when he pushed me against the wall, I was able to look in his eyes, and I could see he was definitely drunk. He may have been high off of something, and I was just staring at that gun, and I'm like, if I don't do something, he is going to kill me. And all I could really think about was my babies. Like, I can't die. I have these babies. I have to live for my babies. And so I grabbed the gun. I grabbed the gun from the barrel, and we kind of got into a tug of war. And then I had the gun in my hands, and just like the stupid woman on Lifetime, I stood there with the gun in my hands. And I think because in the moment I realized, not even in the moment, in like a matter of seconds, it became crystal clear that if I turned the gun around and shot, I would shoot him in the chest and likely kill him. And so while I was trying to process all of that, right, in that 30, 40 seconds, he snatched the gun back. And when he snatched it back, he pulled it from the trigger and it went off. And all I could see was lights. I don't know, I feel like time stood still and there was like this big spark, almost like a fire. And then after time went back to normal, I was on the floor and my leg was just moving uncontrollably. At which point I realized I had been shot. And so, of course, we're both in panic mode. And what I can say is after that, he was no longer high or drunk. He was sober immediately. And I was just like dumbfounded. I couldn't believe that I was laying on the floor. And if you can imagine, like, when a fish comes out of water and how it just flops on the ground uncontrollably, that's what my leg was doing. And so, on top of the fact that I was panicking about my babies, panicking about my niece and nephew, panicking about what he was going to do next, I was thinking, like, they're going to cut my leg off. I'm going to have one leg. How am I going to take care of my babies? Like, I was just in a state of panic. And so I started begging him to give me the phone. Because like I said, I would turn my cell phone off and turn the ringer on my phones off because he would call incessantly. And so the phones were up on my dresser and I had this really big oversized wooden furniture at the time. And once my legs stopped moving, it swelled up like I had elephantitis and it was very heavy. So I could not even drag myself to the point where I could reach up on the dresser and get the phone. So I had to beg him to let me have the phone. And of course, he's still screaming and hollering. And he says, you know what, like at this point, I'm going to jail. I might as well kill you and kill myself. So yeah, I mean, I don't even know what it was that I said specifically. But I convinced him, I said, you know what, if you give me the phone and leave, I will just say someone broke in here. Like they won't even know you were here. Just give me the phone and leave. So finally he gave me the phone and he left, trying to get myself together. The friend who I had stayed with for the month didn't even live a mile away from me. So I called her first to tell her like she needed to come get the kids. And then when I tried to call 911, he was calling me. So when I would like pick up the phone, I didn't hear a deadline because he was calling and saying like, look what you made me do. I can't believe this happened. And I'm like, bruh, like I need to call 911. I'm shot over here. Like, so finally I get the police on the phone. I call my sister and she comes and, so yeah, so long story short, I end up in the hospital for almost 2 weeks. I now have a metal rod in my leg because the bullet shattered my femur. I had to be on a walker for a very extended period of time. I was on crutches I was supposed to be on crutches for 6 to 9 months, but I actually had to quit my crutches early because wintertime in Pittsburgh is not a game. I was afraid that I would slip on ice, and also because I had a baby and I could not walk on crutches and hold my baby's hand. So I just had to thug it out. But so once I got out of the hospital though, I started to have PTSD. And it was because had been in this relationship so long, there was nowhere that I could go and feel safe because he knew everybody. He knew where everybody lived and he was on the run, I should add. He didn't get arrested that night. So he was still out in these streets for about a month before he turned himself in. So I couldn't sleep. I didn't feel safe. And initially I was at my sister's because I had to have a home nurse come in. It was just Honestly, as I tell this story, I feel like I'm telling someone else's story. It's almost like I've lived another life. Um, so finally, I made the decision to go into a shelter because um, I didn't have a home. I couldn't go back to my house after what happened. I just couldn't be in that space. I wasn't able to work because of my condition. So I didn't have the income to support me just up and moving. And so ultimately, my children and I were homeless. So I went into an emergency 30-day shelter. And then once I left there, I was able to get a place with my dad. And so that's kind of the pain in a nutshell. And so after everything happened, once I got off the crutches and was able to kind of function for what that's worth, I decided that I needed a change because I started looking for jobs and I felt like people knew who I was. I felt like they saw me on the news or they read the article in the newspaper, and I just felt like the stigma was attached to me because I had skills and I had education, but I could not get a job. So I decided that I needed a change, and my dad agreed. Excuse me, I have family in Atlanta and I have family in North Carolina. So my dad's like, why don't you go take some time, get a fresh start? And I decided that Winston-Salem, North Carolina was a much better place for me to transition with two young children than Atlanta would have been. So I went to North Carolina and I lived there for 2 years. And while I was there recovering, I always say I went to rehab. While I was there recovering, God met me there. And I should say that um, I always had a relationship with God, right? But you know how they say, like, your grandmother's prayers cover you. My father's prayers covered me. My dad taught me the Bible. He quoted scripture to me. He would pray with me, and he always knew there was something special that God had for me, right? So I always believed in God. I always had a yearning for God. I would ask my dad to like have Bible study. My brother would be like punching me and kicking me under the table because he didn't want to. But when I got to North Carolina and it was just me and God and me, God met me there. And it was it was eerie because when I got there, I went looking for the church that I went to in Pittsburgh, right? So there was a very similar church next to where I was staying with my uncle, and I just went where I knew, Baptist church. And one of the associate pastors was a client actually at the bank where I worked. And she came into the bank one day and she said, I want you to come to this Bible study with me. I think you'll like it. So I was like, okay, I didn't really know anybody. Anybody that I met was either through church or like mommy time at the library where I took my kids because I didn't know anyone and I was being very cautious. And so I went to this Bible study, and when I got to the church, I was like, whoa, it was like a campus. There was like a building for the youth ministry and like a school on the church grounds. And I was just like, okay. Like it was one of those churches that I was used to seeing on TV. When I walked in, when I walked in, there was like a foyer and there was a cafe. And I was just like, what is this? I'd never seen anything like it. And I kid you not, like, how you see on cartoons or like Touched by an Angel, where like the light rains down and the angels are like, oh, I literally had a moment like that while I stood in this church. It was surreal. And so I went to the Bible study, and the women were really nice, and they encouraged me to visit the church. So I visited the church, and the pastor was white. And I was like, this is different. Nothing I'd ever experienced before. Um, but I couldn't stop going to that church. Like there was something there that just drew me. And so I continued to go to that church. And at that church is when I really had my first personal encounter with the Holy Spirit, my first real personal experience, like hearing God. I spoke in tongues once at this church. Like I mean, the time that I spent, though very brief, in that space was transformative. So, in the midst of all of this, we were finally going through court proceedings. And then I got a job while I was in North Carolina, and he was going to court in the midst of my probationary period. And I was subpoenaed, and I was like, I'm not doing this. Like, I'm moving on with my life. If I come back, I'm going to lose my job because I can't miss any days. And so I just didn't go. So ultimately, he ended up getting out of jail. But again, I was moving on with my life, right? So he was there, I was there, we had distance between us. And we had gotten to the point where we could be cordial. So it was fine. And I should say, from the moment that I got in that hospital, I remember trying to hate him. I remember willing myself to hate him, and I could not do it. I hated what he did to me. I hated the decisions that he made, but I just could not bring myself to hate him. And you know, in all of the hell that we went through, like I literally came into adulthood with him. Like we grew up together, and it was not the best experience, but it wasn't always bad. And I guess that coupled with the way that God works within me just wouldn't allow me to hate him. So he got out of jail. And oddly enough, he got out of jail in March of the next year, he was murdered. So then I found myself in a space of feeling guilty, because had I gone to court, he would have been in prison and maybe he wouldn't have been murdered. And even with all that went on, this is still the father of my children, right? So I had to deal with that, and so did my children. So about a year or so after he passed away, we moved back to Pittsburgh because I felt like my children needed to be close to family. And I also felt like I could have peace at home because he was no longer there. And so fast forward 10 years, I had always, since I was a little girl, one of my greatest gifts and one of the things that I love most, like I mentioned, I was always reading. I always wanted to write a book. And I had convinced myself that the reason I hadn't written the book or any books to that point was because I had so many ideas that I couldn't decide which one to write first. But God had made it expressly clear that I was supposed to write about this experience. And I should say that while I was in the shelter, one of the things that I did was I had this yellow legal pad, and I was letting all of the women in there pick their aliases. And I was telling them, like, I'm going to write a book about this because I could not believe the experience that I was having. And so once I got back to Pittsburgh, there was one girl who had been in the shelter with me. I would see her every few years. And she would say, how's the book? Like, when's the book coming out? And I would be like, oh, I'm working on it. Ain't wrote a word. Ain't wrote a word. And then I saw her once in 2016. And she's like, how's the book? And my husband was with me. She's like, I'm going to be in her book, right? And he's like, okay. But that time, something was different. The next day when I woke up, I could not shake that interaction that I'd had with her the night before. And I woke up the day after that. I saw her on a Saturday night. That Sunday, I spent the entire day just like shaken by our interaction. That Monday, I woke up, and within 30 days, I had written that book. Every day I woke up 30 days straight and wrote that book. And it was both a healing and challenging journey, because I had to relive so much of what had gone on. I can't even believe I've made it through this without crying. But so that's how the pain informed my purpose, because it's almost as if like my lifelong dream came true as a result of what I endured. And excuse me, since then, the work that I do is all around helping other women do the same thing, helping them recover from that setback or that challenge or that thing that they felt like was the worst thing in the world that they could never come back from, and really understanding that God is calling us to use and share our stories to rebuild not only ourselves but others. When I was in North Carolina, in one of the Bible studies that I participated in, the focus scriptures came from Isaiah 61. And the woman who was leading the study gave all of us this magnet with the verses, Isaiah 61, 1-4 on them. And just before I had written my book, I was going through some struggles, more than anything financial. And I remember coming home from a small group and just being livid and saying, like, God, why is all of this happening? And I opened up the book for that small group study that I was in at the time. And bam, right there, those same scriptures, Isaiah 61, 1-4. And I won't read those scriptures to you, but ultimately, those scriptures are the foundation for the work that I do. And also, they'll encourage you if you don't understand what God is going to do with whatever He's growing you through. And so I'm going to give you the Tiff's Notes version of those scriptures. And ultimately, it is a proclamation that the Spirit of God is upon you. He's anointed you to do something specific. And there's a list of things that He's anointed you to do, set free the prisoners, give a garment of a joy for those who are mourning, beauty for ashes is that scripture. And I recognized in that moment when I was questioning why I was going through so much after all that I had already endured. And, God spoke to me and He said, how would you be able to serve anybody else? How can you set a prisoner free if you've never been imprisoned? How will you be able to speak to someone who doesn't have any money if you've never experienced feeling like you don't have money? How will you be able to, and you fill in the blank, because I wholly believe that the same is true for you. And so it's allowed me to position myself in a space where I have a different perspective when I'm going through something. I recognize that I'm growing through, not just going through. And it's also allowed me to shift the question. A lot of times, if we're willing to be honest, we do question why, right? We want to ask God why, even though we're not quote unquote supposed to. But through my experiences, what I've learned is the real question is what? God, what is it that I'm supposed to learn from this? What is it that you want me to do with this? What is it that you're going to use me for as a result of this? And it takes a while to get there, especially when you are in the midst of it. But when you are able to shift your perspective and ask what, then you've given yourself the space to understand that there is a purpose in whatever you're enduring. And so that's my journey, and as brief as I can share it. And I hope that if nothing else, you know if nothing else, what I want you to understand and take away from it is, don't doubt your doubts, right? That's number one. But also, I really want you to consider and know the difference between your source and a resource. because God is your source, right? And he gives us people, and he gives us, money, and he gives us gifts that are resources. But if you're not connected to your source, then those resources will be misused, misconstrued, and really have negative repercussions. And at the time when I was young, my parents, they were my source, right? And because of that, what they told me was the law. Like, you can do anything, you can be anything. And I'm not saying that it's their fault that I chose to be in this relationship, but I really want you to consider the information that you accept as law. What I now refer to as true lies, right? They're lies that you've taken on as your truth because of who you subscribe to as your source. But I know now that God is my source. And so I have to qualify everything I think I know by what I believe, as opposed to in the past, I was qualifying everything I believed by what I thought I knew. Hopefully you caught that, because it's so important that you use the right lens to evaluate things and experiences and people. And if you are going through or growing through something, I just pray that you would trust God in the midst, that you would look to God as your source, because even those who love you don't know you the way God does, right? Even those who love you don't necessarily see the you that God sees. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, when I started to make this shift, when I started to really surrender and do the things that God would have me do, everybody questioned it. It was a challenge for people to support it, because it wasn't the Tiff they knew, right? It wasn't the one who was living for everyone else, and they were challenged by that. And I've learned that you have to have the foresight to forgive people, because when you step into who God has really called you to be, when you step out of the pain, I should say, and into purpose, when you get fully aligned, you will recognize that people have faith until they have to have faith. And if this journey hasn't taught me anything else, it's taught me that. And so I know now that I have to seriously cling to Matthew 6:33, and that is seek first the kingdom, because otherwise you will end up in a world of trouble. So I just want to encourage you, and especially if you're listening to this and you're excuse me, and what you think I'm saying is just pray about it. That's not what I'm saying. I want to encourage you to go to God before you go to people. That does not mean that you aren't going to be required to take action. Like I said, I packed up a minivan with 2 children under the age of 3 and moved to another state. God met me there. So you are going to have to take action, but you're going to have to seek God first. Don't let other people tell you what you should do or what you need to be doing. And when you are seeking God first, you will be able to discern wise counsel from people who just have opinions. So hopefully, you're encouraged by what I shared. Because even if you weren't shy, even if you're not in an abusive relationship, there are mountains that we have to climb. And I'll leave you with this. I don't know how long I've been talking, but I'll leave you with this. There is a scripture, I'm sure you're familiar with it, that says if you have the faith of a mustard seed, you can move a mountain, right? And I think that that scripture could have been used to justify why I stayed in that relationship, right? I had faith. I believed he would change. I thought he was the love of my life. But the reality is, it says you have the faith to move a mountain. It doesn't say that every mountain would move. Some mountains are supposed to move you. So if you have the faith to move a mountain, you also at some times are going to need the faith to climb the mountain. no matter how steep, no matter how big, and know that just like your faith can move that mountain, your faith will strengthen you to climb that mountain to get to the point that God has specifically for you. So God bless you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the opportunity to share. And I hope you were blessed by what I shared. Were you blessed by what I shared? Are you facing a mountain that you thought you needed the faith to move, but it was intended to move you? I would love to hear your feedback on this episode. You know that you can take a screenshot, tag me on Instagram or Facebook at the Tiffany Huff. Let me know what you were thinking. Of course, you can also slide up in my DMs and let me know there. And of course, last but certainly not least, if you have not already, please take a moment and leave a review here on Apple Podcasts. It will help another beacon just like you find and get connected to the Bounce Back Blueprint community so that she might be blessed, supported, challenged, and encouraged as you are from week to week. And I will look forward to featuring your review on an episode of the podcast. Last but not least, if you haven't already, you need to hop on over to Facebook and join the new private Bounce Back Blueprint community where it is about to go down. We are planning some amazing challenges and free game Fridays with guests and so much more to continue to support you as you thrive on your journey from setback to impact and income. So grab the link in the show notes and don't meet me there, beat me there. I look forward to connecting with you there. Until next week, remember, God is not going to play you. But if you think that there are some mountains you're not going to have to climb, sis, you're playing yourself. Be blessed.